In this video, I want to discuss the lease or rent decision. This is in chapter 16 of your textbook. Okay, so the first thing I want to discuss is the fact that long-term non-cancelable lease are basically the same as what I call the borrow to own decision, right? So you can either have a long-term non-cancelable lease or you can borrow fund to buy an asset. Just imagine the case with a new truck, right? The company could borrow the money today, buy the truck, and repay the loan over the next 15 years. It could also lease the truck with a non-cancelable long-term lease for 15 years. In both cases, the firm gets exactly the same thing, an asset that it can use today, the truck, okay, in exchange for a non-cancelable fixed payment in the future for the next 15 years. Now, today, accountants treat long-term non-cancelable lease the same as loans. Okay, they just count them as if they were loan, but in the past it wasn't necessarily the case. Okay, and this implies that these long-term non-cancelable lease now show up on the balance sheet. Okay, as I said, that wasn't the case necessarily historically, and you can see that this would create an advantage for long-term non-cancelable lease because they would make the firm look safer, right? Just think about it. If you borrow to own, basically you will have a liability, the loan, show up on your balance sheet, and you'll have an asset, the truck, show up on your balance sheet. If you lease the truck, then you could leave it in a footnote. And then it would never show up as an asset or as a liability on the balance sheet. And because of that, it would make the firm look safer, like it has less debt in its capital structure. Okay? We can separate leases into two different categories, capital leases and operating lease. Capital lease are the one that needs to be capitalized. So basically that just means they'll show up on the balance sheet a little bit like a loan or a borrow to own decision. Okay, so that's what I just said here. To count as a capital lease, one of the following four things must be true. Okay, at the end of the lease period, the ownership of the asset must be transferred to the person leasing the asset. The lease needs to have an option to buy the asset at the end. Okay, and the price of the option price, must be low enough that it's almost guaranteed that the person leasing the asset or the firm leasing the asset will want to exercise that option. The lease is for more than 75% of the life of the property, or the PV of the minimum lease payment that the company leasing will have to make is equal or greater than 90% of the fair market value of the asset. In all of these four cases, if one of these four cases apply, then it is considered a capital lease. Okay, this is typically used for drilling equipment, airplanes, rail equipment, so on and so forth. Finally, as I said, you have operating lease. Operating lease are just short-term and they usually are cancelable. For that reason, they don't need to be capitalized because they're not really necessarily liability. You can just cancel them whenever you want. They're typically used for office equipment or vehicles. Okay, so why would you want to lease? Well, there's a lot of different decisions, right? And there's one that is not written down here, but that might be the tax, right, for tax incentive or tax reason. Okay, so there might be tax reason to want to lease. Other reason could be the leasee, the person taking on the lease, may lack the fund or the credit capability to get enough funding to borrow enough money in order to buy the asset. Okay, the lease condition may be less restrictive than a bond indenture. So if I issued new bonds to buy the asset, maybe that would be restrictive, right? And I don't necessarily want to face these conditions. Okay, so with lease, there's usually no down payment, okay, or not always, but there might not be down payments. And with a loan, you usually have a down payment. So if we don't have the liquidity to pay that down payment, maybe the lease is better. Usually, the lessor, the person who is making the lease, will have expertise in the asset that they are leasing. So they might be better at maintaining the asset, at repairing the asset, so on and so forth. Okay. And also, our creditor's claim can be, on certain leased asset, can be limited or restricted. So, for example, they might not be able to go after those assets in the case of bankruptcy, so on and so forth. Okay, So those are all the reasons and the difference between operating lease and capital lease. Okay. Now we will need to try to think about the lease versus purchase decision. Should we lease an asset or should we purchase it? Okay. We will use the same framework as what we developed in Chapter 12, NPV calculations again. Okay. And I say here this mostly applies to operating lease, the ones that are cancelable, because the capital lease have basically the same accounting treatment as the borrow to buy decision. So there's actually not a lot of difference between capital lease and borrowing to buy. Now, because operating lease are different, then this will apply to operating leases. Okay. Uh, there is an interesting problem in this case when we're going to try to do the NPV, and obviously there will be an example in the next video. Okay, but the loan payments are usually at the end of the year. Okay, the asset will be amortized and will generate a tax shield and interest expense. I think I forgot to write here that basically also the lease payments are at the beginning of the year, and that's what so I kind of missed that out here. It should also say, right, the loan payments are usually at the end of the year, but the lease payments are usually at the beginning of the year. And also, the tax shields that are generated by lease payments are at the end of the year. So we're going to get some kind of weird timing issues with these problems, and I'll discuss it more in the example, obviously. Okay. Oh, this is where I say it. Okay, so I just described the cash flow we're going to need to look at in both cases here. Okay. And one thing that's important to highlight is the 4-point here. When we compare the lease versus buy decision, okay, the cash flows are all certain, right? If I borrow, the cash flows and negative cash flows I'm going to have to make in order to pay for that loan, those are sure. They're written down in a contract. When I lease, the cash flows and negative cash flows I'm going to have to pay are also just written in a contract. So all of these cash flows are certain, okay? And so in this case, we will use the after-tax cost of debt, okay, not the weighted average cost of capital. There's a small little parenthesis here about salvage value. Okay, usually any salvage value would be discounted at the weighted average cost of capital instead of the after-tax cost of debt. And the reason here is that there's a lot of uncertainty about the salvage value of an asset, right? If the asset will be sold in 15 years, it's actually really hard to say what value it will have. So we need to use a higher discount rate for that asset. Okay, and one more thing I want to say before we go to the example is that in this case, we will ignore, right, the cash inflows. Because if we get the same assets, but the question is just how do we finance that asset, with a lease or do we borrow to buy, then the cash inflows that we're going to get from that decision are the same. So they're actually irrelevant to our decision. Okay, so we won't focus at all on the cash inflows. We're actually going to ignore the inflows that are generated by the asset. We'll just assume, okay, we actually do need that asset. We already asserting that getting that asset was good and would generate a positive NPV. And now we're just going to look at the costs, right? Which one has the lowest cost for us, borrow to own or lease the asset. In the next video, I will try to start to do this example here, where I'll showcase how to kind of consider these decisions. Thank you very much.